to a very special edition of Beyond the Ccxp. Today I'm going to be covering behavior change. This is Michael Bartlett, author of Ccxp Exam Preparation. Beyond the Ccxp is a new series I'm starting to help people attain their Ccxp renewal credits. I'm going to cover a different subject, and every time I cover a new subject I'm going to provide some additional reading, and each unit will add up to one renewal credit for your Ccxp. Let's get started and talk about behavior change. So in the agenda today, we're going to talk about behavior change in business. Then I'm going to go ahead and go through some of the most popular frameworks that are in use. Then I'm going to actually give you a simple framework that I've developed, kind of a mash of some of the other ones that you can use right now if you want to get started in this work. You don't have to have a PhD in behavioral science or anything like that. This is very much a practitioner's job, and you can lean on academia if necessary, but it's very important to have the theoretical frameworks. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and provide you that background and then give you something that you can use today. Then I'm going to talk about what the typical intervention process looks like, and then we're going to close off with how to establish a nudge unit in your business. Now, I suppose before we actually get stuck into the content, it's worth pointing out what behavior change is, because obviously we hear these things: behavioral economics, behavioral science. How exactly is this all related to business world? So the way that I would frame it is to think about it this way: businesses are essentially, if you take out the automation side, and even that has an influence to a degree, businesses are made of people. Customers are people. So this whole ecosystem that we live in the business world, it's all about minds, and like, how do you influence minds? How do you change minds? That kind of thing. And so one thing that has really struck me about the behavioral change world is that with not a lot of investment up front, I've found that massive leverage can be made in the business world. The most obvious example is when you see people looking at click-through optimization, click-through rates, and just changing colors, changing wording, changing positioning can make a big difference. Well, this is expanding it right out, because you don't even have to think about websites. This is just day-to-day business, and you could even go as far as to look at social causes as well. They're trying to get people to donate more money, if you're a charity, that kind of thing, non-profit. I will say that obviously there's an ethical side around this. I did think about including a slide on ethics, but essentially you're all professionals, and at the end of the day, I think fundamentally everyone knows the difference between right and wrong. So just follow that as a kind of a guide. Would you be comfortable with an intervention being done to you? Would you be comfortable with it done to someone that you know and care about? If the answers are yes, then it's pretty much, in my opinion, a go. So anyway, we'll go through the content now, and hopefully this will provide you some valuable information in your CX career moving forwards. So behavior change in business. So first, let's look at common challenges with integrating behavior change into business. So people have tried and tested ways of problem solving already in a business. And so when someone comes along with, this idea to use behavioral change, that can cause a little bit of pushback. It's also worth noting that there are some domains, some types of problems that behavior change probably isn't the right solution for as well. So you need to make sure that if you're presenting it to your organization, that you're actually presenting something that's actually going to be useful. There's already existing processes out there that you can follow in terms of optimizing, continuity, processes, procedures, policies, that kind of thing. So this really is only relevant to much more complex problems where you're dealing with a lot of gray areas and decision making and people. That's kind of where I would say that's where you would make the case, if you will, if someone wanted to know why they should use behavior change. Some see it as a gimmick. They'll confuse it with design thinking. Now I actually have another module out today on design thinking in Beyond the Ccxp. That's actually been presented by a good friend of mine, Sarah Corney, who's an expert in this field back in England. So I would recommend that if there's any confusion, you check that module out as well. She does quite a deep dive with a lot of case studies. But essentially what we're looking at here is design thinking is more of a process to solve problems, whereas behavior change is more about looking at, academic work in psychology and sociology, looking at, existing nudges, if you will, that have been made, and then trying to formulate theories about what are the pressures that drive somebody to do a behavior or to not do a behavior. It's very specifically focused on the mind, whereas design thinking can be used for any kind of problem. Really, it's more of a collaborative tool. But like I said, she'll cover that in her module. It's not an exact science, as every person is different. Sometimes you get a lot of pushback, especially when people talk about behavioral economics, because people are expecting that kind of linkage to the finance world that, well, this should be an exact science. If you do this intervention, this amount of people should do the following, or everybody should do the following. And it doesn't really work that way. At the end of the day, you're never going to be able to get everybody to do one thing, everybody not to do another thing, because people are all slightly different. We all got kind of have like the same architecture, the same plumbing that makes us up. And there's a lot of stuff I can go into on evolutionary psychology on that. But essentially, your own experiences, your own memories, your own preferences, those things will cause people to react differently in the same situation. And that can be frustrating for somebody who's looking for black and white answers. A lot of the case studies are counterintuitive. And that's just because, once you get into this field, you realize that people aren't rational, they're irrational. And some people in business, well, again, they want this sort of predictive, everything can be predicted. It's the biggest lie that was ever told about business, is that you can predict the world, and you cannot predict the world. But people want to believe that, and they're under pressure for ROI, and so they will, because they'll see some of these studies and they'll look a little bit counterintuitive, that can put people off as well. And it's not always clear how to tell an experienced practitioner apart from a charlatan. Now, when I say charlatan, what I really mean by that is somebody who has come across this field, they think it's the next big thing, and they think, oh, I can make a buck off of this, and they quickly set themselves up as a behavioral change consultancy or whatever, and then start doing the work without really having any understanding. And so that can be difficult as well. But of course, my advice would be that, look, I'm just about to launch my own practice as well. And essentially what I'm going to do is get a lot of testimonials and a lot of studies from work that I have done to back that up. And again, anyone who has a concern with this, you just point them in the direction of people that do know what they're doing. And people want to see results because they want to be able to predict the future, and they want to know that they're going to get good results. So essentially that's the key, is just to be able to give them as much information as they can to make them feel comfortable. And lots of testimonials and studies will typically do that. So when is it suitable to be used in business? So it's suitable when you're seeking to break a deeply embedded habit, when you want to change internal behaviors in an organization and need a systematic way to diagnose the barriers to such change. This is particularly where it's useful, and I'm going to show you some excellent frameworks shortly that will help you in this process. It might seem very big and intimidating initially, but actually when you get into it, pretty straightforward, and it's a lot of fun as well. When there is a need for a fresh perspective, as older problem-solving techniques have stagnated, and that's the key here, is the older techniques have stagnated. So they don't really have something that can do what they need, and this would be a good candidate for behavior change. When the organization needs to quickly scale the adoption of a new product or process, essentially, sometimes you're not always going to have all the information you need, and you don't really know how people are going to react, so that you can actually do these kind of like behavior studies to give you an idea and then scale from there. And then also when you are building a new innovation and little is known about how customers might respond. So the popular frameworks that we're going to cover today are the MINDSPACE framework, the EAST framework, the Fogg behavior model, and then we're going to round off with something called COM-B. And my hope is that you shouldn't need to take any notes when you watch this presentation. I'm hoping that by the time I've finished, you'll have enough of an appreciation of how all of this works, that really the simple framework I'll give you at the end, plus the intervention process, should be all that you need to go forward. Although, of course, I'll always recommend, further reading and things like that to you. So let's get started with the MINDSPACE framework. So this serves as a reference tool for understanding some of the most powerful factors affecting human behavior. And it was created in 2010 as part of a discussion document commissioned by the UK Cabinet Office. And that document was entitled MINDSPACE, Influencing Behavior Through Public Policy. So, of course, each of these letters makes up one of the things that it tracks. So you can see here you've got messenger, effect, priming, commitment, and so forth and so forth. And on the next slide, we'll actually go through and look at those. So let's go from the beginning. So messenger. So what does that mean? So it means we are highly influenced by who communicates information. And this is obvious. You can obviously look to your own experiences for proof of this. But anytime somebody with, who looks some kind of an official person, whether they're dressed in that way or they represent themselves that way, we're more likely to believe them. You probably remember that famous experiment where somebody who was dressed as a scientist in a laboratory was having people administer pain to somebody else in another room. And the whole thing was a setup, of course, but people did it because he was in a position of power, so they trusted him. And this all kind of it goes back into our evolutionary history of, people that are, more accomplished and more respected by the group likely have made better decisions in the long run. And we want to be just like them, so we're therefore going to trust what they say. Incentives are we respond predictably to gain and loss, and there's different ways that you can apply incentives in behavioral science. Financial is probably one of my least favorite because it's always an external motivator. So, for example, you have a behavior, you add an external motivator of money in, people then do the behavior, then you take the money away, and the behavior will tend to go away. And so, really, when we talk about incentives, we want to look more at, internal incentives. We want to make sure that people are driven by things that are like natural fuel inside of them, as opposed to external gains. We tend to represent a loss at twice the severity as a gain. There's a lot of studies on that you can look up as well. But essentially, that's kind of something that's always worth keeping in mind if you want someone to act. Unfortunately, a loss frame tends to be more powerful than a gain frame. Also, norms. We are strongly influenced by what others do. We all know the idea of social norms. They're explored in a very famous book called Influence by Robert Cialdini, and he talks lots of examples in that book. But essentially, a quick example would be, think about when you are walking down the road and you see 8 or 9 people all looking up. Your instinct is to look up as well. What are they looking at? Something happening on a building, that kind of thing. Typically, when it says 8 out of 9 people prefer, this dog food, again, that's another example of a norm. We tend to follow the pack because in an evolutionary perspective, that was always a wise decision, follow the pack. Defaults are, we tend to go with the flow of preset options. And that's just because thinking takes a lot of energy, and people just don't like to expend that energy. So if something is easier to do, then they'll do it. And defaults tap into that. So there's famous studies where people were given an option to when you join a company and you get your sign-in forms as to whether you want to join the pension program, that kind of thing. Whether you want to donate, another good example is whether you want to donate your organs after you've passed away. And typically, when the boxes were already checked yes as default, people didn't change away from them. And likewise, when they were already checked no as default, people didn't change away from them. So it's one way to just influence the behavior. Of course, I would always caution ethics. Make sure that you are nudging people to make what is an ethical decision, not just what the business wants. Salience, our attention is drawn to what seems relevant and novel. We really pay a lot of attention to novelty. Novelty and surprise really rewards in our brain about twice. In fact, the anticipation of novelty creates a reward in our brain about twice as strong as a predictable reward that we know we're going to get. In terms of priming, our acts are often influenced by subconscious cues. A great example of this would be just the other day, my wife was talking about a particular band and whatever happened to those guys. And then suddenly I found myself humming one of their tunes when I was, in the kitchen making a cup of tea. And that tends to be the way that it works. You can get people into a state of mind. There's been studies. I don't know if they replicated them successfully, but I know there were studies where they had girls take a test and they split them into 2 groups, and half the girls had to think about what it was to be female in this world, and half thought what it was to be, a high achiever or a strong academic, that kind of thing. Anyway, obviously the results turned out the way that you probably would expect. You get yourself in a certain frame of mind, to a certain stereotype that exists, and it tends to influence your behavior. It's very strange. Effect is our emotional associations can powerfully shape our actions. And then commitments, we want to be consistent with public promises. Great example of this is I was trying to save this dog a few years ago, and I phoned up the number, and I was very worried about the dog. And the person said, well, this particular dog is safe now, but we have another dog if you're interested. And I wanted to be consistent with, well, I don't want to look like I'm just picking and choosing, which lives to save. And so I was consistent with my promise that I've called up to try and save a life. And so then I ended up taking the other dog. And that's just a small example. You see this all the way through life, but people really need to, they have this public identity and public commitments, and you need to be consistent with them, because otherwise you lose credibility within the social group, which is obviously bad for you in the long run. And then finally, ego. We act in ways that make us feel better about ourselves. So the next framework we're going to look at is called the EAST framework. So the EAST framework was developed by the Behavioral Insights team from early 2012. And that team's now grown from a 7-person unit at the heart of the UK government to a global social purpose company with offices around the world. So the EAST framework takes a slightly different approach. MINDSPACE was looking specifically at the factors that influence a person. What the EAST framework is doing is saying, let's just look at the things that are needed for a successful behavior change. So the behavior needs to be easy, it needs to be attractive, it needs to be timely, and it needs to be social. So let's go through each of those. So make it easy. So firstly, harness the power of defaults. So I think we covered this already. We have a strong tendency to go with default or preset options since it's easy to do. Making an option the default makes it more likely to be adopted. Reduce friction. This is something Roger Dooley talks about. He even wrote a whole book on it called Friction. Basically, the effort required to perform an action often puts people off. Reducing the effort required can increase uptake or response rates. And then simplify the messages. So making the messages clear often results in a significant increase in response rates to communications. It's useful to identify how a complex goal can be broken down into simpler, easier steps as well. And this is something that you'll see, in a lot of different fields. If something looks like it's too hard to do, people won't do it. But if you can create milestones are a great little behavioral change agent. And then you allow the person to slowly get to each one bit by bit by bit. It makes the task seem less daunting. Another thing you can also do is give them different paths through. I remember hearing this about a student who wanted to graduate, and they thought that they hadn't done enough to carry on the path they were. And the lecturer said, well, there's actually a different path you can go, and you hit these other milestones, which are slightly different, and they will still give you the end result. So giving people multiple ways to achieve things and giving them milestones as well gives them a sense of progress. People like that accomplishment. And of course, reducing friction, so you make it as easy as possible. I signed up with this application recently that was supposed to give me like a mortgage quote in seconds or minutes or something, and the whole thing was completely missold, because I did the first few steps, and it was doing the little performance track around like a circle, got to 100%, you're all done. I thought, great. And then it had me create an account, and then I had to do all these other questions. And so they didn't really upfront give me an idea of the effort that was required. And you'll hear about this a lot in customer experience. I think Colin Shaw talks about it a lot. He says that we do mental accounting before we do a task. We have a think about how long is this going to take, how much effort's required, and then we decide whether we're going to do the task or not. And if someone misleads you, that can really upset you. Like, I will not be going back. In fact, I actually went with my bricks and mortar company when I refinanced my mortgage, and it was much easier than this app. So anyway, I hope that explains why you need to kind of make things easy, reduce the friction. It's all common sense. Make it attractive. So attract attention. We are more likely to do something that our attention is drawn towards. Ways of doing this include the use of images, color, or personalization, and design rewards and sanctions for maximum effect. So financial incentives are often highly effective, but alternate incentive designs such as lotteries also work well and often cost less. I'm going to show you a lottery example in one of the examples coming up shortly, where I talk about different kinds of nudges that you can do. But let me give you a tip with this whole financial thing. So what I've heard, if you're trying to get somebody to do a behavior that they're not particularly interested in, financial rewards can be a good way to start the behavior off. But then what you need to do is transition that into something more internal, like I touched on earlier on. And if you can do that, then that hopefully will help them build the habit in a way that's sustainable. That's kind of like one of the recommendations that author Nate Andorsky recommended in his book, Decoding the Why. Then you need to make it social. So show that most people perform the desired behavior. Describing what most people do in a particular situation encourages others to do the same. Similarly, policymakers should be wary of inadvertently reinforcing a problematic behavior by emphasizing its high prevalence. So let me give you a classic example of what has happened recently. Wikipedia, they were trying to they were needing to raise money to fund their site. And so they had this little banner at the top that was there to try and appeal to people to have them, donate money. And they had some horrible messaging. It was something along the lines of, 95% of people just move on by and don't pay any attention. Will you be one of the 5% that helps us? Well, they actually hurt themselves by doing that, because all it does is it says the majority of people don't do this behavior, therefore I won't do the behavior. So you need to be very careful about things like that. Use the power of networks. We're embedded in a network of social relationships, and those we encounter shape our actions. It's actually a very interesting study. I remember it referenced in a book called Bottlenecks, which is all about user psychology and user experience. And he talked about the study. I think it was absolutely insane that 3 people can completely change your behavior. If you know 3 people that do something differently than you do, the way just that number alone, because they tracked it from different, like one person all the way up to, I think it was 10 people, and you get diminishing returns after 3. So 3 is the magic number. If 3 people that do something, you're more likely to do it as well. Networks can be leveraged to enable collective action, provide mutual support, and encourage behaviors to spread peer-to-peer. Finally, we have encourage people to make a commitment to others, which we touched on already. We often use commitment devices to voluntarily lock ourselves into doing something in advance. The social nature of these commitments is often crucial. So you'll see it's sort of covering some of the things from MINDSPACE, but the idea was they wanted to represent it in a more condensed way. Make it timely. So prompt people when they are likely to be most receptive. The same offer made at different times can have drastically different levels of success. Hooking a behavior into an existing habit is one way to increase its exhibition. So, if you want people to take their pills in the morning and they have a morning cup of tea, then you might try and link that behavior to the morning cup of tea, because they're already doing the morning cup of tea. It's already a habit. So, as a behavioral change advocate, you go in there and you work with them and you try and set it up so they start doing that. And then hopefully that ends up becoming embedded into the existing habit. The funny part about prompting people when they're most likely is a lot of the times I'll be on my computer and I'll be working and my wife will say, hey, later on, can you do X? I think the other day she said to me she wanted me to add like 3 things to the Amazon cart. And I was like, yeah, sure. And then I carried on working. Well, do you think it got done? Of course not, because she prompted me at the wrong time. I'm just going to forget that. So you have to be very careful about making sure that you prompt people when they're most receptive. Humans have kind of 2 modes as well. They operate either in a goal-seeking mode or a non-goal-seeking mode. So if you're engaged in a task and you're busy, you're most likely in a goal-seeking mode. That is the worst time to try and get your attention or do anything. But if you're in an open sort of non-seeking mode, which is typically what people are when they're just scrolling social media feeds or they're just having a bit of downtime, that's the best time to catch somebody. Consider the immediate costs and benefits. So we're more influenced by costs and benefits that take effect immediately. We automatically discount costs and benefits that happen in the future. This is known as hyperbolic discounting. So this is why it's hard for people to do behaviors now that are going to benefit them later, like eating healthy and things like that, because when we think of our distant selves, they seem exactly the same as a stranger to us. Help people plan their responses to events. So there is a substantial gap between intentions and actual behavior. A proven solution is to prompt people to identify the barriers to action and develop a specific plan to address them. I'm doing some work right now with folks in Little Rock who have had gastric sleeve surgery, and we're trying to work with them to help them continue the right behaviors so that essentially they don't fall back into old ways and have some bad repercussions. And one of the effective takes, we're actually using quite a few different ones, but one of them is to basically what are the barriers? Funnily enough, family is one of the worst ones, especially when you get people that come from these families that all like to eat. They actually can bully the person who's had the surgery and lost the weight. and try to undermine them, which is terrible, but hey, I mean, that's just human dynamics, I guess. So then, of course, you have to help them have specific plans in advance to address that. So anyway, that's the East framework. So we started off with MINDSPACE, and it had all the things that really affect a person. Then the East framework tried to kind of condense that down into these are the things a successful nudge typically has, a successful behavior change has. Well, now we're going to go down even more. We're going to simplify even more with the Fogg behavior model. So the Fogg behavior model simply says that a behavior is a result of motivation, ability, and prompts. What he means by this, if you look at this graph, is if you are highly motivated to do an easy task and then you're prompted to do it, you'll do it. If you've got very low motivation and it's very hard to do, then the prompt won't work. Some prompts are external prompts, others are just internal or built into existing habits, as I mentioned. But this is a really nice, clean way to think about behaviors. So we do behaviors that are easy to do, that we are highly motivated to do, and of course that we can remember to do. Now, Jason Hreha, who's one of my favorite behavioral scientists, this is a little, this text on the right side of the screen here is an excerpt from an article he wrote, and I love this. He says, in general, behavior change interventions can be put into three categories, right? Simplification, motivation, and instigation. So simplification is all about making a behavior easier. So that's the bottom of the graph there, the x-axis. Motivation is all about making a behavior more excitable or enjoying. So that's the y-axis. And then instigation is all about making a behavior salient or top of mind. It's about reminding people to do a behavior. And I love that, because if you have this model in your head, then it's just nice and clean. And it's a really easy way to think about why someone either does a behavior or doesn't do a behavior. Now, the CompB framework is probably the most respected framework that's currently used. The CompB framework is made up of three components that influence behavior. That's what the Com stands for. The B just stands for behavior. So that stands for capability, opportunity, and motivation. And essentially, this is what they say. For behavior to change, what three conditions need to exist? Well, firstly, the person must be motivated to make the change. They must be capable of physically or psychologically making the change. And there must be an opportunity that enables and prompts that behavior. So if we look at them individually, we see capability here is listed as psychological or physical ability to enact the behavior. Motivation is reflective and automatic mechanisms. So automatic is like a habit or just something that you do without thinking. Like when I pull out of my driveway in the mornings and I hit that button to make my garage door come down, I just do that automatically. In fact, one day my car was outside of the house and the garage door was already down and I just hit it on instinct. I link it to the habit of starting the engine of my car and reversing. So it's interesting how that can happen, but that's kind of what the automatic side means. Reflective just means you're thinking about it. You're contemplating, is this my values? Is this something I want to do? Does this mean something to me? And then opportunity is the physical and social environment that enable the behavior. So here's another way of looking at them, and I've color-coded them for you. So I've put them into three columns here: capability, opportunity, and motivation. But the color coding is the key part here. So everything you see in green is the individual. So these are things that you can look at that affect the individual. So physical capability, does the person have the necessary physical ability to perform the behavior? Psychological capability, do they have the knowledge or the skills? Then we go over to the other side, motivation. Do they have the goals and values? And also, does it require any logical thought, or is it something that's just going to be automatic? So those are the areas that you can change if you're trying to, influence someone to do a behavior at the individual level. Now, let's look at the red text. So this is the interpersonal level. So this is social opportunity, other people and their effect on the behavior. So your intervention might target the individual. It might target the interpersonal side as well. Then the final side is the physical opportunity, which is the physical environment. So the environment and surroundings and whether it helps or hinders the behavior. So this is very important to know, because not only do we look at each of these things as a potential barrier or a potential source of fuel to do a behavior, but we can also think about it in these contexts as well, and that can help inform our interventions. So these are the general intervention functions that come with CompB. So you can use education to impart knowledge or understanding. You can use training to build skills through instruction and or practice. You can use persuasion, which means convincing someone to do or think something or feel a certain way. You can use incentives, which is simply creating the expectation of a reward. You can use coercion, which is creating an expectation of punishment or cost. You can use restriction, which are techniques to make the behavior harder. You can use enablement, which are techniques to make a behavior easier. You can use environmental restructuring to change the physical or social context. And you can use modeling to provide an example to aspire to or learn from. So we're going to see some examples of these now. So first of all, let's have a quick look at this grid. So the grid basically takes each of these intervention functions. I've listed them along the top here. This diagram here is taken from the book Engaged by Amy Butcher, and I totally recommend this. This would be like my first text that I would recommend to anybody who is interested in exploring behavior change further. She talks in depth about the COMBI framework. She actually talks about some really interesting motivation theory called self-determination theory that you'll find very useful as well. So that's kind of where this comes from, but I would recommend that if you want a further deep dive. But essentially, you have your intervention functions across the top, and then you have your COMBI components down on the left-hand side, and it shows you where they're most relevant. So let's take an example here. So I know recently I started going to see a personal trainer in the gym. And what happened was, one of the reasons I didn't really like going to the gym was for this reason, the social barriers. I didn't really like the idea of trying to work out in front of other people. You can see how that might be a big issue for a lot of people, especially if they're very overweight or out of shape, because you almost feel you're being compared to the people in the gym who look immaculate. So that always put me off. I've never really liked an audience anyway, even when I do anything. And so you can see here what they would recommend is restriction, enablement, or environmental restructuring or modeling. Funnily enough, it was, a little bit of modeling, but environmental restructuring is what made the difference for me. I found a gym who had taken an innovative approach where they have a personal trainer that has, the building has individual rooms that have all of the equipment you need. So it's like having an entire gym to yourself, just in a smaller space. And so that enabled me. And then the modeling also came because I watched a podcast with a guy who's like an ex-military guy who was really explaining about why it's important for people to go out and exercise and take care of their physical health, and how that actually has benefits to your mental health and to your focus as well. And we all got a bit down, during the lockdown, the pandemic. So that really helped me, to motivate me to go do that. But the social, the environmental restructuring helped with the social side for sure. So let's look at some nudges that have actually been accomplished doing each of these different techniques. So education. So STAIRS at the Utah Valley University aim to provide education about calories burned to motivate students to use them. Education nudges can also just be simple brochures with information or formal education. The more creative and unusual something is, the more it's going to stick out. People are going to notice it. So this is why this is probably going to be a lot more successful than just a information brochure. But likewise, it provided the information, and that education, having that information really is going to help the people to maybe take the stairs more, and to motivate them to burn more calories. Training. This is actually a comedy one, but so during the lockdown, I changed my behavior in relation to cooking. So I did this by watching YouTube videos on making Indian food and then practice repeatedly until I could cook some dishes from memory. But my wife has been known to leave post-it note instructions around the house when she is not happy. She didn't write this one. I just grabbed this off of the internet. But for example, we bought a new kettle, and she didn't like the fact that whenever I boiled the kettle to make a cup of tea, the steam would go up onto the bottom of the cabinet, and it would, she's worried it was going to warp it. So she wanted me to angle the kettle out. Now that behavior is very easy. If you think about it from a COMB side, yes, I've got the motivation to do it. I want to, be able to not cause my house any damage. And it's capability. I've got the physical capability. Really, the opportunity was the problem. It was the prompt. I just kept forgetting to do it. So all she did is she changed the environment. She just put a little sticker up to remind me on this big blue piece of tape that I wouldn't miss to make sure that I angled the kettle out. And she did it enough times that one day she took it away, and I've just carried on doing it. It's become an embedded habit now. So this is a great example of what I mean by training, which is constantly providing instructions in some way or format until the person actually gets used to doing something. So persuasion can be one of the most powerful types of intervention for behavior change. If we can link it to our identity, am I the kind of person who wants to kill animals, for example? Well, of course you're not. They also work by playing on inbuilt associations in the mind. So this is a great example where someone made a bag that in order to hold the bag, it makes you look like you're strangling this little turtle. And so it's a good way to just make that linkage between plastic bags and the outcome. Very, very powerful. I remember I saw a short film living in England many years ago, probably looking about 2005, 2006. It was a 5-minute film, and all it was someone starts brushing their teeth, and I thought, well, what's going on here? I didn't really quite understand what was happening. There was some music playing, and then I realised that at the bottom of the screen, these little icons were appearing to show liters of water. And as the tap was running constantly in the background while they were brushing their teeth, these liters of water icons would keep appearing until they finished. And they ended up using like 7 liters of water just to brush their teeth. And that changed my behavior immediately, and it has lasted with me till now. So it's amazing how one little 5-minute short film made a difference. I refuse to run the water now when I brush my teeth, because I'm so conscious of the water that I'm wasting. A great idea for incentives and coercion, this one actually won a prize, is speed camera lottery. So it uses speed cameras at intersections to reward those who obey the speed limit with the fees paid by those who violated it. So it's an incentive and a coercion at the same time. They're basically two sides of the same coin. It taps into our inbuilt love of variable schedule rewards as well, which helps to maintain good behavior. So what that means is if you know there's a chance that you might win, you won't become dissuaded if you don't win the first few times. When you finally do win, then that really gives you a boost. And it's one of the reasons that keeps people coming back to Facebook and to all these other social media websites while people continually scroll, is they're hoping to get that little hit, that little reward of something interesting or something that's relevant to them. But there's never a guarantee that it's going to be there. But ironically, the lack of the guarantee is what keeps people coming back. So that's what helps reinforce the behavior here with the speed camera lottery. Then we have restriction and enablement. So in an experiment by Green Nudge, food waste was reduced by 22% by reducing plate sizes in hotels. And the great news is patrons barely noticed the difference, and their satisfaction scores were still the same. So this is a great example of restricting. Not having junk food in the house is another great example. On the flip side of this, enablement makes the behavior not only easier, but can also help make them easier to remember to do as well. And so you can just think of enablement as being the opposite of restriction. Having a support group, that kind of thing, would be another great example of enablement. Environmental restructuring, this is one of my favorite nudges that was done by Ogilvy. But basically what happened was there were like different corners and places within these train stations in France, and people, I guess, who'd been out drinking and come home on the train were using them as unofficial urinals. And of course, poor old passers-by and station workers had to put up with this. And it was very nasty. You can imagine the smell, or just the general, just makes everything feel horrible and puts people in a bad mood. So one of the famous quotes is, when we do not give a particular purpose when we do not give a particular purpose to a place, we let people decide for themselves how to use it. So, of course, that's what happened. So they said, in our case, a children's play area is a very, very simple way to say to the potential offenders, no, this corner of the wall is not a place to urinate. This is called a framing effect in behavioral sciences. But basically, they restructured the environment. And what happened was it's not just the restructuring of the environment that makes the difference. Of course, it's the emotional associations that you have as well. These could have been like pictures of cute dogs, and it probably still would have worked. At the end of the day, it's almost like the person will urinate something that looks dirty, looks like somewhere where you would urinate. They wouldn't go and urinate on a cute animal or a child or something like that. That's kind of where this association comes from. Modeling, this comes from, actually I took this example straight from Jez and April's book, Ripple. So he says that Overbury employees took turns to walk around with health and safety specialists to assess risks taken by their peers. So normally they would just be the ones working and the health and safety people would walk around, but they got to step into those shoes so that they could model what the correct behaviors were and actually look at it from a compliance perspective. The walk around was supported by a script which asked questions in a certain way to reinforce good behaviors in the employees' minds. And that, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it was a significant reduction in bad or dangerous behaviors, let's say. So now we're going to look at, we've been kind of simplifying as we've been going. Now we look at behavior change in one diagram. So Matt Weyart, who is the author of Start at the End, says to think about the world in terms of pressures, okay? And he says if pressures are the levers, then interventions are how we pull them. And he says his framework is 2 arrows. He said literally think about the world like this. And I'm going to read the text to you. This is an excerpt from my Kindle edition of his book. He says, mind-bending, I know. But remember the goal of this book. I want you to actually create behavior change every single day. And sometimes simple frameworks are the best way to get that done. These arrows represent the balance of competing pressures that create our behavior. Promoting pressures, the up arrow, make a behavior more likely, and inhibiting pressures, the down arrow, make a behavior less likely. What we actually do is determined by the net product of those forces. If the promoting pressures overcome the inhibiting pressures, we act. If the inhibiting pressures are stronger, we don't. And both sides are equally responsible for the ultimate behavior. We can never say people don't act because of lack of promoting pressure, because it could equally well be phrased that the overwhelming inhibiting pressures are responsible. I love this. It's nice and clean, and it kind of summarizes everything that we've talked about so far. And so that's why I'm going to give you this simple framework to take away with you. So if you're looking to enact behavioral change in your organization, or maybe there's a social cause that needs your help, I would simply say this. First of all, start off with Matt's framework. What are the competing pressures? You'll have to list them out. What are the things that make someone more likely to do something? What are the things that make them less likely to do something? And then your intervention typically would, well, it probably would do a bit of both. It would boost the up arrow and reduce the down arrow. You might just do one or the other, though. There is that possibility. But do that first. Then say, what do we want to do? Do we want to make the behavior easier to do, which is looking at the capacity of the person or the opportunities available? Do we want to make the behavior more desirable to do, which is specifically looking at motivation? Or do we want to make the behavior more salient and top of mind? So that's using Jason Hreha's model as kind of like the next question. And then finally, you can turn to Con B and you can say, okay, so how are we going to do that? And then you can look at each of their intervention types. And there's lots of information on the internet about this. You can read about these in more depth and the different tactics that can be used with each of these categories. But essentially, this is the framework that I would recommend for anybody starting out in this as a place to begin. So now we're going to look at the intervention process. So this actually is a process that I've borrowed from one of my books, talking about using behavioral change in the business sector. I'm going to put a link in the description so you can go check that out as well. But essentially, the author says that the intervention process typically has the following steps. Understand the problem in context, define the intervention space, ideate to design interventions, prioritize interventions, and simply then test and evaluate. So, to understand the problem in context, define the target population and the behavioral outcomes. So you need to define who it is that you want to change the behavior and what the specific behavior is. Or it could be a number of behaviors, but these are things you want to influence. I would also tell you to challenge your assumptions. I'm going to give you a bit of a controversial example here, but let's say that you work in a business and the leadership tells you that they don't feel that the organization is inclusive enough. And so they want to increase the percentage of say, non-white employees. We won't go into gender or any other stuff. We'll just stick with literally the racial component. And then you look at the data and you actually see that the makeup of your company race-wise actually matches the country that you live in. So at that point, you might want to challenge the assumption as, well, we might actually already be inclusive. And the reason that you're seeing what you're seeing is because of the makeup of the country. And, you would maybe look at the makeup of the city, of the state, because obviously they all change slightly as well. But it's very dangerous to just run headfirst into a lot of things and assume the worst. Everybody assumes the worst about everything these days. And, the world isn't quite as bad as people like to say it is. That's not to say that we can't do better, but you've got to change. You've got to challenge these assumptions. Otherwise, you can end up making a situation that is actually quite good really bad. And that's one of the things I would always stress with behavioral changes. You've got to watch out for unintended consequences. You have a system that's working quite well, and you disrupt that system in some way. Complex systems theory will tell us that it's almost impossible to predict how these things will turn out. And that's why normally when I recommend any kind of behavioral change, I recommend piloting, small scale changes first to see what happens. But you go in and you disrupt the system with some sort of big change that you think is going to make a huge difference, and it's all based off a bad assumption, you could end up actually causing a business to fail in the long run. So you need to be very, very cautious about that kind of stuff. So I cannot stress that enough. And you probably won't hear many other people say that as well, because it's not the politically correct thing to say. Use Matt Welliott's model to find the barriers and promoters. So his inhibiting and prohibiting pressures, we'll call them sometimes barriers and promoters. So look at existing models, theories, or interventions. Do some data analysis if you do have data analysis on what people say versus what they do. Ethnography and interviews. Of course, you want to get a diverse group because you really want to understand the problem from as many lenses as possible. And then also look for common themes. There's the book called Upstream, is very good, where they talk about surrounding the problem. And what you do is you don't just get a diverse group, but you get people that are related to the problem, either upstream or downstream from it as well. So if you were looking to tackle homelessness, you wouldn't just interview the police officer that arrests the person that's on the side of the street, maybe with a drug problem. You would interview all the kinds of different people, including people that work with drug rehabilitation, people that evict people from their homes, like landlords, that kind of thing. And I'm taking all of this from Upstream. That's an actual example. I recommend that book if you're looking to make behavioral change at a bigger level, social level. They talk about some fantastic interventions, reducing homelessness, reducing spousal abuse, those kind of things. So the bigger scale, that book is highly recommended. Then you want to define the intervention space. So what you want to do is deconstruct the analysis from step one and look at what and where to influence. You might also look at the COM-B categories, like education, restriction, and so forth, and decide where you want to target. Southwest Airlines actually built a map of their areas of influence, and they drew these out, and then they use these as a springboard to say, okay, where do we think we're going to get the most bang for our buck if we focus on intervention, and then we're able to zero in that way. That's when you begin to ideate to design interventions. So firstly, is there a single intervention that honors all the pressures, all of the prohibiting and inhibiting pressures? If not, look for pressures that seem to dominate in both the qualitative and the quantitative research and create several interventions around them. You want to set yourself up for a range of pilots that maximizes the chance of success. You want to aim for optimum distinctiveness, which is a range of possible options that cover as much as possible with minimal overlap. And then you want to consider combining interventions to reduce the option set as you close in on creating your final list that you're going to go forwards with. Really, the beginning is it's about volume, just coming up with as many ideas as possible, very divergent kind of thinking. And then you want to go into convergent thinking and then narrow them down so you have your final option set. The next thing you want to do is then prioritize the interventions from your shortlist. So you want to look at them in terms of, what's the impact going to be versus what's the cost. They've in this book they talk about it as reward and risk, but essentially that's one way of doing it. This is simply a basic prioritization matrix, and you would do that, and then that would allow you to finally land on what interventions are going to be feasible to go forwards with, and then simply you just test and evaluate. So how do you define success? And you also need to be mindful of ghost victories. This is another term that comes from Upstream. I recall that they set a phone number up where people could call in to report if there was damage to the sidewalks. And of course, people were calling in and they were very happy and they thought they'd had a very successful intervention until they realized that the people who needed it the most, the people in the most rundown areas, either didn't know about this number or they didn't think there was any point in calling it because they didn't think anyone would do anything. And so it looked like a victory, but actually, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes these things can backfire. Also, you need to decide what is your ultimate outcome metric. What's the ultimate outcome metric you're checking? So let's say someone wants to lose weight. It's pretty obvious. It's going to be the scale. However, what are your short-term metrics for navigational aid? So Chicago Public Schools wanted to reduce the dropout rate, but they couldn't afford to wait 1 year to find out if the intervention worked. So they used attendance and grades as an on-track proxy. So these are things you need to think about as well, because you need to be able to, especially if there's investment into the intervention and it is a long intervention that's going to take maybe a year or two to realize whether it worked or not, you're going to need some proxies, to decide how that's going. So anyway, I wanted to mention that because that's a very important point. Now, in terms of establishing a nudge unit in your organization, here are my recommendations. I would start small and start with an internal group and look at internal nudges as well. So basically, don't go to the customer side yet. Just look at what you can do with employees. I'd find a diverse group of employees who have an interest in this area. I'd operate with leadership approval under the guise of an experiment. That way you lower the expectations, give yourself a chance to fail and pivot, and then produce concrete results before looking to become official. So once you've got those concrete results, then that will enable you to expand the unit and start doing bigger work. But it's always best to start small and start with lower expectations. By doing that, it buys you time, it helps you to establish trust, provides an opportunity for the team to get used to working with each other, to learn, to grow, to get their processes in place. That's what I would recommend to anybody who's thinking about doing this. So that concludes this edition of Beyond the Ccxp, looking at behavior change. If you're wondering what Beyond the Ccxp is, I basically have decided to set up a specialized set of training for anybody that has their Ccxp and wants to renew it. In order to renew your Ccxp for 2 years, you need to gain a number of renewal credits, and each of my trainings that I offer comes with additional material, additional reading material and so forth, that when you complete everything, the goal is that you'll have enough renewal credits to renew for another 2 years. So if you want any information, just hop over to beyondtheccxp.com and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition. We've got more coming up today, so I'll see you guys shortly.